In Mankato, Minnesota, the Sioux Native people and the Minnesota Historical Society are arguing about a 150-year-old piece of rope that hung one of the 38 condemned Sioux Native people. Some say that the rope should be burned, and some say it should be returned to the hands of the Sioux tribe. Others argue that the Historical Society should display it in remembrance of the hangings. The hangings were the American settlers' reaction to the crimes of the Sioux during the Dakota conflict of 1862. As a reaction to reforms such as the treaties of 1851 and 1858, the Sioux started a war, the Dakota conflict of 1862 with the white settlers. The war lasted only 6 weeks, but an estimated 600 Americans were killed, and it had long-lasting effects on the rights of Native people. Americans angered the Sioux when they failed to keep their side of a series of treaties. In the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux in 1851, all of the 7,000 Sioux who lived in Minnesota moved onto 2 narrow strips of land in exchange for $1.665 million in cash and annuities. The Americans never paid them all the money they asked for. 7 years later, in 1858, the Sioux signed yet another treaty, which reduced the reservation by another 11 million acres. Differences between the Sioux and the American culture spurred the Sioux on to war as well. In the Sioux culture, sharing and helping other people was expected. In the settlers' culture, it was every man for himself. In the year 1861, the Sioux were starving because of a crop failure and because the game and animal population was rapidly decreasing. So they had to ask the white settlers for food. To the shock of the Sioux, the settlers refused to give them what they asked for. The Sioux' poor trading relationship with the settlers spurred them on to war. The Sioux paid for the settlers' supplies on credit, but the traders changed the numbers in the books, and the Sioux could not argue against them. The traders also refused to pay their debts. Most of the traders did not care at all about the well-being of the Sioux. Andrew Myrick, a spokesperson for the traders, said about the starving Sioux,
"So far as I am concerned, if they are hungry, let them eat grass."
Everyone was inconsiderate of the Sioux. Some settlers provided food for them and taught them new farming techniques. The American government helped the Sioux build some houses for them and provided some food for them. However, the Sioux were more focused on the failure of the Americans to keep the treaties and the unfair trading relationship. In 1861, most of the American troops in Minnesota were fighting in the Civil War, so the Sioux decided that this would be a perfect opportunity to fight. On August 17, 1862, 4 Sioux killed 5 white settlers near Acton, Minnesota. Hindaktia describes the
It was not the intention of the nation to kill any of the whites until after the 4 men returned from Acton and told what they had done. When they did this, all the young men became excited and commenced the massacre.
The evening after the raid, the Sioux held several councils to decide whether or not they should declare war against the Americans. The Sioux were deeply divided over the issue, but they decided that it was time for them to fight. On August 18th, the Sioux attacked the Redwood Agency and killed 44 people. Samuel J. Brown, an American who witnessed the attacks, described some of the victims.
When we had proceeded a little ways, we came upon 4 dead bodies, 3 men and 1 woman, all horribly mutilated. Our captors had committed the murders. The men had been mowing, and the woman had been raking hay. Their scythes and pitchforks lay near. The woman had a pitchfork sticking in her person, and one of the men had a scythe sticking into his body.
Over the next few days, the Sioux killed over 200 Americans. On August 23rd, the Sioux attacked the Americans again. 652 attacked the city of New Ulm and burned most of the buildings, but the Americans successfully defended the city. However, 34 were killed and 60 were wounded. On September 6th, after losing the Battle of Bull Run, Major General John Pope was appointed the commander of the American troops in the Northwest and was assigned to keep the Dakota conflict under control. In a letter, General Pope explains,
"It is my purpose utterly to exterminate the Sioux if I have the power to do so, and even if it requires a campaign lasting the whole of next year."
Battle of Wood Lake was a decisive victory for the Americans. While the fighting was in progress, a group of Sioux who were against the war gained control of 269 American captives and set them free. The war ended when Henry Sibley raided the Sioux reservation and took 1,200 Sioux men, women, and children prisoner, and later another 800 Sioux surrendered to the Americans. In a short 37 days, about 600 Americans and 60 Sioux were killed.
In reaction to the Sioux' brutal fighting, Americans tried 393 Sioux men who had been involved in the Dakota conflict. The commission handed out a death sentence to anyone who fired in battles or bought ammunition or acted as a commissary in supplying provisions to the combatants or had committed some separate murder. In 6 short weeks, 300 Sioux were declared guilty and sentenced to be hanged. Abraham Lincoln wanted to try to distinguish between the more guilty and the less guilty, so he reduced the number down to 29, and the rest were sent to prison in Fort Snelling. On December 26, 1862, in Mankato, Minnesota, huge crowds gathered to watch the condemned Sioux be hung in a single-drop execution. The Mankato Free Press reported, "When the platform fell, a surprised but joyful shout went up from among the vast throng of spectators, but all was perfect order. It was a sight never before seen on the face of the earth. Justice is done." To the onlookers, the execution was payback for the 600 American settlers that the Sioux killed in the 6 short weeks of the war. The execution was, and still is, the largest mass execution in American history. After the execution, Americans imprisoned Sioux who were in favor of the war in forts around southern Minnesota, and forced the Sioux who were against the war to move from Minnesota and South Dakota down to Nebraska. They felt like they were being kicked out of their home for simply being Native people. Some Sioux have moved back to Minnesota today, but they still have wounds from the war. Because the Sioux were no longer living in Minnesota, there was much more room for Americans to settle the land. The American population in southern Minnesota nearly doubled during the 5 years after the Sioux left. In 1902, the American government offered to pay people injured in the war and relatives of those that died in the war. They still pay these pensions today. The Dakota conflict was a turning point in the natives' fight for their rights, because even though they lost, they were encouraged that they fought against one of the strongest nations in the world for 6 weeks. In 1864, the Cherokee continued the fight and started a minor war with the American government over land disputes. Also, in late spring of 1866, the Sioux leader Red Cloud orchestrated a successful war fought over American forts built on Sioux land. The Dakota conflict created many divisions which are still apparent in the tribe today. The Treaty of 1851 divided the Sioux into 2 separate geographic regions. They no longer lived together as one tribe, and the Sioux were and still are divided on whether or not they should have started the Dakota conflict. Many historians tend to vilify either the Americans or the Sioux in the Dakota conflict. Some sympathize with the Americans and emphasize the Sioux' brutal fighting. Some sympathize with the Sioux and emphasize the unkept treaties, the trials, and the forced removal from Minnesota. However, both sides had low points and high points throughout the war. The American side was not all bad. Many settlers provided food for the Sioux and taught them new, more successful farming techniques. Even though the Sioux killed 600 Americans, the Americans held back their desire for revenge, and only 60 Sioux were killed throughout the whole war. The Sioux side was not all bad either. Their fighting was not without cause, as Guy Lopez, a member of the Sioux tribe in Mankato, said,
"The war was not out of the blue and was not without provocation."
Also, not all the Sioux were involved in the war. Many were against it. Some Sioux even helped free American captives. Today, both sides agree that the war was wrong. Big Eagle, a Sioux chief, admitted,
"The war was wrong. We all know that now."
The Americans are still trying to make up for what they did to the Sioux people during the Dakota conflict. Today, both sides are still trying to heal from the open wounds that the war left behind.